Y'all know Tony McBride. It wasn't that long ago that he did the lesson. Mm-hmm. And you know that Tony, it's really Dr. McBride, graduated from UT, or undergraduate, PhD from Ole Miss, organic medicinal chemistry. Mm-hmm. Taught organic and biochem washout courses at Sanford. Okay. 16 years, wildly successful career as the Associate Dean, School of Pharmacy, and kept all those kids from, of course, being pharmacists by teaching the washout course. But married to the charming, saintly Carol Nash McBride. Excuse me, Ellen Carol Nash McBride. Okay. 2 sons, rocket scientist, financial wizard, and 2 granddaughters, beautiful granddaughters, and a step-grandson, 4 years old. Mm-hmm. But this is the part you do not know. Okay. College summers. You know, usually don't go to college in the summer. Okay. Tony and his cousin were drag racers. I understand they got a lot of practice on the streets, but they went to Buffalo Valley drag strip, Buffalo Valley, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. All right. They had a what year was it?
57.
57 Chevy station wagon. It was green. And of course they called it the Little Red Wagon. Mm-hmm. Tony's cousin was color impaired, as far as we know. But fuel injected. They had welded the rear end together. It was a 671 GMC. And so they had a homemade positraction. Okay. They won a lot of races, especially when it was hot and humid.
Right.
Okay. That's because the other drivers couldn't see as well. Was that it?
No.
Okay. All right. Help me welcome a man who could have been a famous NASCAR driver. Instead, he chose to go to pharmacy school and prepare the lesson for today, Dr. Tony McBride.
Okay. All right. It's with some trepidation that I present today's lesson. Carol asked me, I guess early in the week, said, "What are you going to talk about?" And I told her, and she said, be careful. So I'm going to be careful. I don't have an axe to grind. Several weeks ago, I became interested in this subject, and I approached it from a scientific point of view. Talk about, if this works, alcohol in the Bible. Yeah, go ahead. Get it over with. All right. For the first 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to wonder, where's this boy going? Yeah, okay. Alcohol that people drink, it's also known as ethanol. Any fruit that contains sugar can be fermented to make wine. Natural, for example, when we say wine, we're usually talking about grape wine. There's natural yeast that exists on the grape skin on the outside, and when you crush the grapes, it mixes and it begins to ferment almost immediately. How do yeast make alcohol? Well, here's the chemical, and I know you're going to eat this up. The sugar undergoes glycolysis to pyruvic acid, and pyruvic acid to ethanol and carbon dioxide. If you've ever seen wine being made, it bubbles. Carbon dioxide's coming off. And then air will cause the wine to sour to what we call vinegar. The Latin for wine is vinum. Agri simply means sour wine, means bad wine. If you didn't understand all that, we'll get to it in just a second, but man uses pyruvic acid, which is a metabolite of ethanol, to make energy or fat. You've heard people talk about the traditional beer belly for people who imbibe too much, because if you don't need the energy, it will make fat. If you didn't understand all that, I got you one that you will. Grape juice, yeast, magic, you get wine. Okay. All right. A little bit about making wine. I'm sure you know this. You crush the grapes. The yeast on the outside begins the fermentation process. You protect it from oxygen, because if you have oxygen in there, it will go on to vinegar. Makes sour wine. Somewhere around 10% ethanol, believe it or not, the ethanol concentration begins to kill the yeast. And so that's about as high as you'll ever get by a fermentation process. Going too far. The Romans used lead pots for fermentation. They found that warming the fermentation increased the production of a sweeter wine. However, vinegar was reacting with the lead to make lead acetate, which is known as sugar of lead. So the sweeter it got, the more poisonous it was. Lots of the Romans died from chronic lead poisoning by drinking their sweet wine. Nevertheless, the Romans learned to make vinegar and to use it, as we shall see. Ethanol production and some terminology. I am against this, but today corn is the chief supplier of ethanol in the United States. Corn is fermented and distilled to yield 95% ethanol, which we burn. If you ever notice on the gas pump, it'll say 10% ethanol. I think it is the height of stupidity to burn food, and that's what we're doing. We could be using the corn for production of food. How much ethanol is produced? Well, I looked this up. You know, I know a little bit about railroads. I love railroads. Last year, the railroads in the United States hauled 396,000 tank cars of ethanol at 82,000 gallons per tank car. That's 11 billion gallons of ethanol that was made from corn. I do not like that. Some terms. Proof. Most of you know that proof is twice the alcohol content. 100% alcohol, 50% alcohol will burn. If you get below that, it won't burn. And so they call that 100 proof. 95% alcohol, known by some names like White Lightning, PGA, pure grain alcohol, Everclear. I was watching a show on Alaska the other night. They have a lot of problems with Everclear. It's just 95% ethanol. Tell you a little story about White Lightning. My grandfather, I saw some eyes roll here. I taught school for 38 years. I watch facial expressions. Okay. My grandfather bootlegged. He was not a good man, I'll have to say that. Carol's grandfather was a good man, but he made a little alcohol. During the Depression in Bloody 8th of Putnam County, Tennessee, where the police would not go, they made a little alcohol. And so as he got older, he and I would sit around and we would talk. And he told me a story. He said that he was walking home from his still one night, and a man jumped out from behind a tree holding a bottle of what it was assumed to be White Lightning. And he took a .45 and he cocked it and he held it right on Carol's grandfather and said, "Drink some of this." So he took it and it burned all the way down. And then the man handed him the pistol and said, "Make me drink some." Well, I knew I was had. But I laughed and I've always remembered his story. All right. Now, there are medical uses of ethanol. Assisting in falling asleep. But there's a stigma attached to that. I worked as a pharmacist for 4 years. 3 years while I was in school and 1 year after I got out. About once or twice a year, I'd get a prescription for bourbon. Well, we didn't stock bourbon in the drugstore. And so I would go to the patient and I'd say, "Here's what I got to do. I don't stock this." And I knew why he was there. He could not, in his mind, come to go buying a bottle of bourbon and drinking 15 cc's or an ounce at night, which the doctor wanted him to do, help him go to sleep. But if it were a prescription prescribed by a doctor, he had no problem with that. So I would explain that. I said, "I don't have it here, but there's a store across the street. I'll walk over there and I'll get a bottle. I'll come back. I'll pour it in a prescription bottle. I will label it, and you can take it home and drink it with a clear conscience." So he was sitting right there. I go out through the little gate, and I was going out the door. He said, "Get Maker's Mark." That's a true story. All right. All right. Ethanol is also used in methanol poisoning. Every now and then somebody gets some bad alcohol And the same enzyme system that metabolizes methanol metabolizes ethanol. And so kids that go down to the pharmacies and in hospitals are surprised to see ethanol IV. And they will do that for ethanol poisoning. What you try to do is to saturate the enzymes with ethanol so that the body will leave the methanol alone. And so you can save lives with shooting IV ethanol. It's also an antiseptic. 70% isopropanol, we're all familiar with that. A lot of people have asked why 70%? It's the lowest concentration that maintains 100% effectiveness as an antibiotic, or as an antiseptic. That's the reason they give 70%. Some of you may remember Dr. Tishner's antiseptic. It was 140 proof. It was made with ethanol. People soon realized, I can drink that. So Dr. Tishner's was removed from the market. It is also a solvent for drugs. Some of you probably have taken an elixir before. An elixir is a hydroalcoholic solution of a drug. Elixir of phenobarb. It's got alcohol in it. Toxicity. I have heard in my lifetime preachers get up and say, alcohol is one of the most poisonous compounds that you can ingest. Well, it's not. It's not. It is one of the least toxic alcohols that we encounter. And it's odd. Methanol is extremely poison, causes blindness, causes death. Propanol. Isopropanol. I have seen in my lifetime a person who could drink isopropyl alcohol. It happened to me when I was working in a drugstore when I was in high school. A man came in, wanted 2 bottles of isopropanol. I rang it up. He started out the door and the pharmacist called him and said, John, no. And he took the alcohol away. I gave the guy his money back and he went out the door and I'm saying, what? And the pharmacist said, he drinks it, and his wife has told everybody in this town not to sell John isopropanol. But he could drink it.
Is that rubbing alcohol?
That's rubbing alcohol, what they call rubbing alcohol. And I got to back up one here because I missed one. Let's see. I want to think very, very clear. Make this very, very clear. Moderation is taught in the Bible. 1 Timothy 3:1 talks about bishops. Bishops must be vigilant, sober, of good behavior. Deacons must be grave, not given to much wine.
Sounds like if you're not a deacon, you're okay.
Bingo! They come to me and say, you want to be a deacon? I say, nah. Okay, no. And Ephesians 5:18, not be drunk with wine, wherein is excess. Dangers of ethanol. I learned this very early in graduate school. It is true. There are some people who have a genetic disposition to alcoholism. A few drinks and they're hooked forever. That is true. You can treat alcoholism with a drug called naloxone. The same drug is used to treat opiate addiction. Alcohol is stimulating the same receptors of pleasure that the opiates do. Antabuse. I mean, have you ever heard of antabuse when you treat? Okay. Very, very dangerous drug. The way it's supposed to work is this. You take a patient, you load him up with antabuse before he comes into your office. You give him about 10 cc's of alcohol and tell him to drink it. He gets sick, as sick as a dog. You've heard that experience. He gets deathly sick. And the doctor comes up and he takes him in his hand and said, do you like that feeling? No. If you drink, that's what's going to happen to you. And so as long as he's on antabuse and he knows if he drinks, he's going to get really, really sick, supposedly he'll quit. But the danger is they may get in a situation where they drink a lot and it will kill them. So antabuse, not used very much. If it is, it has to be extremely controlled. All right, let's change gears and talk about wine in the Bible. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, possibly 2 more. But those terms are used to describe wine in the Bible. I called my Jewish friend last night, and he's not in town, so he didn't answer my call. But I want him to pronounce those Hebrew words. So I'm going to do the best I can. I said it's yayin, trosh, shikar, and I know venom. And I suppose the Greek word here is oinos, and then glucose, from which we get the term glucose. The first three are found only in the Old Testament because they're Hebrew. The bottom three are found in the New Testament because they are Greek. The word appears 200 times in the King James Version of the Bible, translated wine, where it's one of those 6 words. Only venom, onios, and glucose are New Testament terms, the others in the Old Testament. Examples in the Old Testament, we can think up of a lot. All you got to do is Google wine in the Old Testament, you'll get a lot of hits. Some of the most striking, Abraham, where he drank wine and was drunken, was uncovered within his tent. It's the first example of the use of the word yayin in the Old Testament. Lot's daughters, who got their father sick, went into the tent and lay with him. The word there, drink wine, the word is, again, yayin. Examples in the New Testament. Now there are those who will argue that the word oinos can refer to a non-alcoholic beverage, i.e. juice, or it can refer to an alcoholic. I think you would argue, if you were just looking at this, that when the Good Samaritan poured oil and wine on the wounds of the person who had been robbed and beaten, he was not pouring grape juice, because he was using wine as an antiseptic. I think that's perfectly clear to me. Okay. Other New Testament examples. Now, this is the one that's most controversial. Wedding feast in Cana. The mother of Jesus said, they're out of wine. And finally the Lord He accepted that. He said, bring in 6 big jugs, fill it with water. And he turned the water into onios. Now, some argue it's alcoholic. Some say non-alcoholic. Same words used. I have heard arguments all my life. Some of you have heard these too. Well, they didn't have good water. It was coming out of cisterns. It was coming out of wells. And then you can argue back, well, he could have made good water. Could have turned it into good water. And then there's my Baptist friend who said, well, he did make wine. I admit that. But I'd have thought a whole lot more of him had he not done that. All right. My point here is the wine is onios, the same one that's used where he poured onios on when the Good Samaritan used it. Okay. And then in Acts 2:38, the day of Pentecost, others mocking said, they are filled with wine. Glucose is used. And then Peter stands up and said, well, they're not drunk, because they were accused of drinking an alcoholic beverage, obviously. All right. A word about glucose. Now, this is a fact that if you talk long enough, you get dry mouth. So. This is not vodka or anything. This is water. Okay. Freshly squeezed grape juice may be referred to as new wine. You see that in the Bible. But I will tell you this. New wine without refrigeration, which they did not have, or without quickly boiling it to make almost a syrup or to kill the yeast, will quickly ferment. It will do that. Now, question, and this is a big one. Was the glucose mentioned on the day of Pentecost fermented or unfermented? Big question. The word onios is not used. But there are some who are for fermented juice, wine. And probably two reasons. The Jewish custom was wine at communion. That's custom. And there are some who argue that fruit of the vine can mean wine in a larger context. Now, if you're against it, you say the word for wine is not used, and it's not. And 3 Gospels use fruit of the vine. John does not mention communion. Before I go there, I know some of you want to ask a personal question, and I want to tell this little story about me. Tony, have you ever been drunk? Absolutely. Now, before you quit gasping, I heard gasp all over the place. I will tell you, I was drunk, but alcohol had nothing to do with it. I go to a dentist who gives me nitrous oxide because I cannot stand to be worked on unless I've got my gas. Here's what happened. I went to the dentist. His nurse came in. She started me on my happy gas, as she called it. And about 10 minutes later, the dentist came in, anesthetized the area with the xylocaine. And then he turned out the lights and left me with my gas. Ordinarily, I control my depth of anesthesia by taking the little mask which simply lies on your nose, and you pull it up and you breathe air for a while, and you sort of control how you feel. I went to sleep. And when I woke up, I woohoo! And they heard me from next door where they're walking on a patient. And they came in and I was out of it. And they call it laughing gas because the stages of anesthesia, you get analgesia, and then you go into delirium. I was in the delirium stage. I know what I would be as a drunk. I would be a happy drunk. If you go to a dentist who gives you nitrous oxide, be very careful. When you're under the influence of nitrous oxide, they can come in, he'll say, well, McBride, your teeth are okay, but we've got to take your gums out. And you'll say, have at it. Now, having told that story, let's talk a little bit about vinegar. I'm going to go someplace you've probably never been before. The Romans had learned to use vinegar to extract various medicinals. It made a concoction that was very potent. In the United States, vinegars were official in the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is the official compendium of drugs used in the United States, until the early 1900s, in which they were removed. In the crucifixion, that's recorded in all 4 Gospels, Jesus is offered sour wine. How'd they do that? They put it on a stick, they put a sponge on a stick, raised it up so he could drink. The Gospel accounts. Matthew, he is offered, but it does not say that he drank it. Mark, offered, does not say that he drank it. It is unclear. Luke, same account. Offered, does not say that he drank it. John, however, it is clear that he was offered wine on the sponge and he drank it. Or pardon me, vinegar on the sponge and he drank it, not wine. Excuse me. I'm going to pose this question. I've thought about this ever since I was in graduate school. Was the drink vinegar of opium? Roman soldiers carried vinegar of opium as a painkiller if they were wounded. Opium, you've probably never seen, They take the opium poppy, they make razor blade cuts around it. The latex oozes out, it's dried in the sun, they come and scrape it. It is an awful smelling, black, tarry mess. Well, that's not a good way to take it, and so they learned that they could dissolve it in alcohol, or they could dissolve it in vinegar and make an extremely potent analgesic. It was known at the time and would have been laced with enough morphine to kill a healthy man. Did it hasten his death? I say that it did. My argument for opium. No account in the 4 Gospels tells that the 2 thieves were offered the vinegar. They were apparently alive because the soldiers said, listening to the Jews, break their legs. And they wanted the legs of Christ broke. But he had already drank the vinegar. Jesus was dead when they came to him. You die on the cross from asphyxiation. Morphine would definitely have hastened asphyxiation. How does a heroin pusher get rid of somebody who's giving him trouble? He gives him an overdose of the drug. The guy dies from asphyxiation. So it will definitely hasten the death. Now, why were they doing this? Well, Jesus had to die by sundown on Friday. Most people believe that he was crucified on Friday. And I put an asterisk there because that is a subject of a huge debate. Some people say, well, there were 2 Sabbaths. Well, some people in this room that believe that. You can believe that. It may be true. I believe that it was on Friday and they buried him before sundown on Friday, which would have been Sabbath. He stayed in the grave Friday, parts of Friday, but that counts as one day. He stayed there Saturday, a full day. And then at 6 p.m. Saturday night, it became Sunday. That was the 3rd day. And he arose very early on the day. Well, I put that subject to a great debate, and we'll talk about that at another time. All right. Summation. It appears that. Now, that is a good word for y'all to use anytime you want to. You don't have to make a commitment. You simply say, it appears. I put that in italics. I bolded it. I underlined it because it appears that. Here we go. Alcoholic wine was used in both Old Testament and New Testament times. It was alcoholic. Use of the wine is good for the health. I believe that. Paul to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:23. Drink a little wine for thy stomach's sake. The word there, onios. Alcoholic. Use of too much wine is definitely forbidden. Drunkenness is forbidden. Also, wait a minute, whoa. It also appears that the wine in Cana definitely was alcoholic. It appears that. You may argue against that. You may argue for that. I simply say it appears that to me. Okay. And also it appears that the fruit of the vine in the first communion was grape juice and not onios, alcoholic. I have gone to churches of Christ where they believe that it should be alcoholic, and you expect grape juice and it's not, and you, whoa. But they obviously believe that it should be wine. The fruit of the vine should be wine. And then just like Homewood today, I suppose we could go either way, but you'll realize that we use grape juice here. And most congregations now will use grape juice. But there are religious groups in Christendom that still hold to using wine. Okay. Well, I don't know, Russ, if I've given you any encouraging words or not. But my encouraging words are, if you drink in moderation. Do not become drunk. And if you don't drink, don't start. I'd like to encourage you to do all 3 of those. Oh, it must be over.
All right.